okay? And I just got a message saying recording in progress. So see, Sarah is handling this session. That's why the recording is going okay. So our third event in this speaker series is in the works, and it's going to be a very different type of program than these first two sessions, which I see as both really important for people's professional development. The next program, I think, is going to have a much more personal essence about identity issues and so forth. So keep an eye on the message center. That's my school's system. Keep an eye on the listserv for that announcement. So the plan for today, I have to leave in a moment to go teach a class because that's what I get paid for. But I'm talking about attachment, probably my favorite topic, so that's cool. So today's plan, Doctors Schnicker and Davis are going to give a presentation, then there will be ample time for Q&A after that, all right? So it's really my true pleasure to introduce Doctors Davis and Schnicker. They are two not just emerging, but wonderful clear stars in this division and leaders in this field. Ward is currently Associate Professor of Psychology and Director of Clinical Training at Wheaton College in Illinois. Sarah is currently Associate Professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at Baylor University. Before going to Wheaton, Ward was at the Rosemead School of Psychology at Biola, and Sarah was previously at the Thrive Center for Human Development in the Department of Psychology at Fuller Theological Seminary. So they represent a pretty impressive and central pedigree, educational pedigree that really helped create so much of the infrastructure of the psychology of religion and spirituality. I could speak at length about their productivity. I'll just say they have been embarrassingly successful and prolific in their early careers. Look at them. There's not a damn gray hair in either of their heads, damn it. And their publication productivity, their grant work is just remarkable, and they've both been crucial leaders in our field. So with that, I'm going to put it in their good hands. They'll offer some really important information through a PowerPoint presentation, and then there's time at the end. Okay, and if anybody wants to contact me by email, it's Boyatzis, you see my name, at Bucknell, BUCKNELL.edu. And if you have any suggestions or requests for future events in the speaker series, that would be wonderful. So I'm going to sign off now and go talk about attachment. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks so much, Chris. We are really appreciative of you setting all this up, and we just appreciate all you're doing to lead this division. It's a delight to be with you all today, and it's great to be with my friend and colleague Sarah and talking about these important issues. And what we'll do is we'll have basically around maybe 20 minutes or so of presentation, and then we'll open it up for the rest of the time to be dialogical. And Sarah and I will be just going back and forth in some of the presentation of these slides. The slides are available via a link that I sent on the Division 36 listserv. And if you don't have those, if you're not on that listserv, please email Sarah or me, and we'd be happy to send those to you.
Ward, we are seeing the presenter view. We're seeing the notes view rather than just the slides.
Got it. Let's see. Oops. Try it again.
Try it again.
Is that right or no? Okay. All right. So the title of our presentation is Open Science of Religion and Spirituality: Problems, Myths, and Possibilities. So just to start out, we would like to first of all give a shout out to one of Dr. Schnicker's colleagues and students, Mara Alkire, who did a lot of the help with preparing these slides. And as we look at the context of this discussion, essentially we are trying to understand where did this problem happen out of which this need for open science emerge. And if we look at the culture, the broader culture of global society and the specific culture of psychology and academia, we see there was within academia this publish or perish emphasis that led to people basically wanting to publish as much as they could, so that emphasis on quantity over quality, and wanting to publish things that had flashy findings, flashy headlines. And so we had people who were publishing a lot, publishing things. Basically, they were overstating what they were finding, overstating the generalizability of what they were finding. And they were kind of trying to put things out quickly, put research and research findings out in a quick manner. Embedded within this, we also had a lot of questionable research practices that people were just routinely engaging in, and this includes, at least I can speak for myself, and I think I could also speak for Dr. Schnicker, that we engaged in these for years and didn't think much of it, just because it was kind of, that's what everybody was doing. But at this point in the field's history, we thankfully are just starting to be a little bit more self-reflective of what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we might do things a bit better, you know, with more integrity, scientifically and morally. Some of these questionable research practices include p-hacking, so exploring different alternatives until something is significant, and then potentially hypothesizing after you already know the results. So kind of saying you expected to find something all along, and then crafting your manuscript as if you found exactly what you were expecting, and being selective about what variables and results you're reporting. That would include, you know, just throwing a lot of different measures at survey participants, and then only reporting on the 3 to 5 that ended up being significant. Suppressing non-significant findings, we've all known that's a problem for a long time, the file drawer problem. And if we put all of these questionable research practices together, we see that the field was really ripe for some need for evolution as the field. And there was just this lack of rigor that was happening within our scientific research, broadly within the field of psychology, and also specifically within the psychology of religion subfield. There also was a lack of reproducibility. So a lot of findings were being produced and being disseminated, and they were only one study with a very limited sample. And there was not sufficient detail within the published manuscript to reproduce the findings. And those findings that were able to be potentially reproduced, you see some of the headlines here. Basically, many of them were not able to be reproduced when someone else did a replication study. And so we have all of this constellation of factors happening, and out of this, the open science movement has emerged. Essentially, this is a movement to increase openness, transparency, integrity, and reproducibility in science. So that essentially is what open science is all about, is trying to enhance these 4 qualities within the scientific field broadly and within scientific studies specifically. It's attempting to improve people's access to research and people's ability to replicate research findings. As we think about access, there are a lot of different things that can mean, and what that tends to mean within open science is sharing openly one's materials, data, and publications. And those are kind of the main forms of open sharing that happen within the open science movement. And when it comes to trying to enhance integrity of our science, one of the primary ways that open science advocates doing that is through pre-registering your study. And basically that means pre-specifying what you plan to study, who you're going to study, what you predict you're going to find, all the details of your methodology and analytic plan, and then having that time stamped so that you can say with certainty, this is what I was expecting to do, and this is what I was expecting to find. And once you collect your data, then you can kind of go back and say that what you are doing is what you planned to do all along. And Dr. Snicker will talk in a little bit about the possibility and potentiality that a lot of our studies, we pre-specify things one way, but there are other things that come up as we're conducting studies, and you, of course, can say, I'm going to explore this, or this didn't exactly go as planned. But when you have something pre-registered, you're able to point to what you did have pre-registered and say that aspects of what you pre-specified, you were in fact, you did in fact do that, and then other things you were not able to do, and to explain why. A registered report format is a format of conducting research and publishing research in which the peer review happens before you conduct the study. A lot of us are very used to trying to publish a manuscript, and we get to the submission process only to have peer reviewers point out fatal flaws that we have, for whatever reason, overlooked. And so one of the ways that Open Science has helped to redress this problem is to have us start to conduct the peer review before we conduct the study, so that peer reviewers can help us think through things theoretically, methodologically, that we might not see within our own research team as we're preparing a study. And so in the registered report format, peer reviewers will help us think through these things and get to a place where, if the peer reviewers and editor believe that the study is worth conducting, they will grant an in-principle acceptance after stage 1 of the peer review process is undergone. And that in-principle acceptance says, we agree with the plan you have made to do this study, and we are saying we will publish this study regardless of the findings if you do what you said you're going to do, and what we've agreed on now based on the refinement that's happened through peer review. And then you conduct your study, obviously after getting all ethical approvals from your institution or institutions that are involved. And then once you conduct your study, you write that up and you send it back to the peer reviewers, and they will review your study in the way you have described, conducted and analyzed and interpreted your data. And they will give you further refinement that might be needed to refine your what's called stage 2 manuscript. And they will primarily be checking to make sure that you did what you were saying you were going to do. And if you did, and if your project goes through the refinement at stage 2, then it is published. And there are many ways that this can happen, but essentially people are publishing registered reports within journals, and then a lot of times they're publishing what are called preprints. So the accepted version that is published in a separate online repository that can be accessed even before it is officially published. And a lot of times that those preprints are typically available for free, and that's regardless of whether it's an open access article or not. And preprints can include many other articles that are not registered reports. And that preprints are becoming a lot more utilized within the field of psychology as a way to make sure people have greater access to research. Within psychology and within the sciences broadly, open science practices are becoming very common and generally expected. At the same time, they're not yet well understood or well utilized in our psychology of religion spirituality field. And Dr. Snicker is going to take over from here to talk about several of those potential reasons why, and then to talk about potential solutions for that.
Thanks, Ward. And I'm back. My computer suddenly died right after Ward started talking, so I didn't hear all the intro, but I am back. And I think, so I'm not sure if I'm repeating, so wave at me if I've already said something. But I think part of the reason we first came to having this webinar was actually an associate editors meeting at Psych of Religion and Spirituality. And even among our editors, Ward and I were talking about it, but people have a lot of concerns. And it was the discussion we were having amongst ourselves that Chris Boyatzis was like, oh, we need to let other people hear this and have this conversation. And really, I think there's some common myths or concerns about these open science practices that are part of the reason I think we've not adopted them more fully in psychology of religion and spirituality. And so part of what we want to do today is just take time to address these really explicitly. And I've only come up with a couple. And I hope our discussion time at the end really can help us to explore other concerns you all have and to think creatively too about, as a field, what we want our norms to be. Maybe there are ways we can set up our open science practices as a field to alleviate any potential downfalls that these practices have. So a first concern we heard expressed among our own colleagues in psychoreligion and spirituality was that open science pushes us towards only confirmatory hypothesis testing, doesn't allow for exploratory studies, doesn't allow for the rich qualitative work that we really need in psychoreligion and spirituality. We have some awesome work in our portfolio as a field, but we don't have a lot actually compared to some other fields that have been more rigorously attacked over the last century. And so I would say that this is not actually a case. I think this is a misperception about open science practices. So they do not dictate that you have to do only confirmatory work. What they do require is that you have integrity in upfront and as you're writing up your results, that if something was exploratory, you present it as exploratory in your publication about the work. And one of the practices we really use in my lab, pretty much across the board, is pre-registration. So this is different from the registered report where you actually get partial acceptance. This is just going on to a public place, and I'll show you some examples of this in a minute, and just stating ahead of time, this is what we're planning to do. This is who we're planning to sample, things like that. And we've registered exploratory work. So it could be, we're going to use a grounded theory and just do qualitative interviews. And this is the method we're going to use, but we're not making any hypotheses. That's okay. It's really just the fact that you go on and document what you're planning to do and what you are going to hypothesize, or whether you don't have any hypotheses up front. That's the point of it. That way you don't take what was really exploratory and turn it into something confirmatory. My lab has also done pre-registrations of archival data sets of new analyses we're going to do. So let's say you're using a data set that's already out there, like the National Study of Youth and Religion, for instance. Even though the data are already collected, there is an option you can check that these are archival data, or even we've collected them, but we didn't register ahead. We forgot, or we collected these a long time ago before this even existed. But before we actually go to do our analyses, here's what we're expecting and planning to do. So there is flexibility in the pre-registration. It's not like the journal reviewing where someone's like, oh, you need to revise this. It's just publicly time stamping whatever you want to put out there. I've also done the process. So for longitudinal data analyses where you're running complex models, I know some people are doing that who are on the call perhaps. Something we've also done is done a staged pre-registration. So we'll start with, this is the data we're going to collect. Here's our first steps of cleaning, data exclusions, how we're going to keep people out, and maybe our first hypothesis we're going to test. And then we have these other ones, but we need to figure out what the data are doing first, because can we run a latent growth curve model? It depends on if there's trajectories of change, or can we do different things? So we kind of lay out our steps in almost a sequence of if then. So if we have these kind of data that come in, we'll go this route, otherwise we'll go this other way. So it's not meant to be a rigid thing. It's just helping you to articulate ahead of time. So the next one. So another concern that we've had expressed in psychoreligion, but also I think more broadly, and APA has written about this, that open science practices, could they be making our research process more onerous? And is it preventing people who are already at the fringes and marginalized from getting their work done and getting it out there? So to respond to that, I would say it changes the patterning of effort, but I don't think it's actually more effort overall. So it requires more careful thinking up front when you're doing a study. So I am old enough, not a ton of grays, have a couple. Chris just couldn't see them. But I remember kind of in my early years before all this, when I was in grad school, like, oh, let's just collect these data, and just kind of threw a survey up and had an IRB, but didn't really articulate what we were trying to do or what hypotheses we were going to test. It was just their opportunity was there. We just got the data. And then eventually at some point you actually have to figure out what you're testing, how you're going to test it, do it well, write up a compelling reason for what you're doing, right? So these are steps that had to be taken, but they were sometimes taken after the data were collected. This process is requiring us to do it earlier, which honestly leads to more high quality work. Because I don't know about you all, but I know I have said, oh, why didn't we measure that variable after the fact when I was writing up the publication? And I have found on several occasions doing the pre-registration and really articulating on paper the hypotheses, how we're going to exclude participants, all these different things has improved the quality of our study designs. We have actually said, ooh, I'm going to need that to control for or as a moderator, and just forcing you to do it up front improves research. I think it can actually save time. I don't know if I'd argue for that, but I think it does because there's less mistakes. And here I would say that registered report format that Ward was talking about that we're trying to promote in psychoreligion, I think that definitely saves time, because I have had studies where we have great expectations, really well thought out, but I have null results. And as I imagine many of you have experienced, like, what do you do with that? Now, no one likes to publish null results, but it was solid. And we know, even though we try as a field to publish null results, human beings are biased. And so reviewers are able to find all kinds of other problems of why it might be null when they know that the results were in fact didn't come out. So I think the register report format can actually save a lot of time in the end for people, because as long as you stick to the plan, you're guaranteed a publication, even if none of your conditions work out in an experiment, even if you don't find what you're expecting. So it's a more of a guaranteed effort instead of a risk to do certain types of studies. The last concern that I think I've heard from a lot of people is that open science practices focus us too much just on method to the detriment of theory. So in response to this one, I do think you see this a bit in the short term. So I have experienced this sometime when I've tried to do registered reports myself and with our lab. Sometimes I'm like, that reviewer didn't really engage the theory. They were only looking at the method, and that's not good science either. So I think there may be some credence to this in the short term. But I think long term, once we start to get used to it, it will actually make us focus more on theory, because we are having to hypothesize a priori with transparency before we conduct our research. what's going on. And so this one we want to always be careful about. And I think I know as an editor at PRS, when I'm doing registered reports as they come in from Ward's grant, I will definitely be looking at theory and the theoretical rationale, not just the method. And I imagine that will be true of all of our editors and the other journals that are participating. So I think this one is a risk, but we can solve it just with some real intentionality. All right. Go ahead to the next one. So there's a great resource for those of you for whom this is new. The Open Science Framework, OSF, is a foundation or a framework, a method that has been established online. It is all free. For those of you who have Templeton funding, a lot of us do in psych, religion, and spirituality, they have funded part of the development of this framework. So it's an open source repository. It helps you think about how to do these things, how to have a centralized workflow, how to organize your work, how to be transparent. They really have trainings in this on their website. They help you think about how to organize your lit reviews so they're more systematic with different tools you see here. And for today, I'm not going to go into all of these in depth. That would take us far beyond our time, but just want to make you aware of these and point you toward OSF as a great resource. But I just want to show you a project example. So this is one Mara Alkire on the call, I believe, right, did with Wade Rowett and some others. Right, so they registered their project. You can add all your collaborators up front. You can have all the files you want associated with this project all in one page. You could actually generate a citation from this OSF page to cite in other studies. You can see in the bottom right, there's a recent activity box where you can see all the changes that have happened, right? You could come in here and update a pre-registration with a new file. So like I was talking about with a longitudinal study, if you're like, oh, we've gotten this far, now we want to update our plan. You could go in here, do that. It's time-stamped and people can see when exactly that happens. And ideally, some people make these things public from the get-go. You do not have to. A lot of times on my team, we keep them private. So no one else can see it except your team, but it's still time-stamped on the website. And then once the article is published, you also publish this website page, and anyone who's reading your article or can come on and actually see that you are transparent and did what you said you did. There's also ways to set it up so that reviewers can view it, even if it's not the whole public. So they have a great tool here. Go ahead, Ward. Right, and the pre-registration, this is what I use the website most for. It's really for you to declare your hypotheses, and both those that are exploratory and confirmatory. You outline your method, that what's your sample, how are you recruiting, what's the sample size, how are you going to decide when you're done recruiting? That way you're not just checking your results along the way and be like, ooh, we found it, we're going to stop now. That's not good. You also really want to talk about planned analyses here. So what exclusions, this is a really big deal, of what rules you're going to use ahead of time to decide whose data gets excluded. What are you going to say are the outliers? How are you going to look for exclusions? Are there attention checks, things like that? Because this is really important to declare upfront. And again, I will say in studies we've done, we have a plan. Every now and then something pops up that we didn't think about. And we just go in and document it at that point, that we did not anticipate that this would happen, but we realized that these people were just making things up and we didn't expect that they would there. So we're now going to exclude them, but you just are declaring it in time, real time, that you didn't actually anticipate that ahead and you decided that to exclude people based on a certain criteria after the fact.
I will mention one thing, if it's okay, Sarah.
Yeah, please.
I think it's helpful to know that also there are pre-registration forms for qualitative research as well.
Yes.
Qualitative research is a very different, obviously, in its epistemologies and its methods, but there are now standardized pre-registration forms for qualitative researchers to use to help specify aspects they can specify at the beginning of a study.
Yep. And that, I think if you go to the next slide, Ward, right, so OSF has templates for all these things. So you're not just figuring out how to do this. They have templates you can download and just fill in with all the pieces from your study, examples of it, right? So primary data, secondary data, and qualitative. And I think that is very helpful and a real service to the field that we're not all trying to reinvent this on our own. And I think it's important to know, how do we know if people are actually implementing open science practices? So many journals are now using this badge system. And these badges are for open access. So that's the paper's going to be available for anyone. Open data. There's a big push to make your data publicly available so that anyone can come and analyze it themselves. I will add here that that is not a requirement. Many of us work with populations that are more at risk or would not want their data shared or somehow identifiable. So in a lot of journals, they'll ask you to make a statement about your data sharing. And I've done this in personality and social psych journals where the default is you really have to share your data unless you have a compelling reason. And I've given compelling reasons and never has there been pushback. So for example, I'm studying a sample of Muslim and American adolescents. There's a history with this population having their data shared when they did not ask for it and be shared with the government and used for government surveillance. We are not publicly posting these data. And that's a very great reason. Or it's a clinical sample where it might be identifiable. And this is an at-risk group. It's not something that's appropriate. So you have a lot of autonomy as the researcher to make the ethical call on whether it actually is ethical to share. But the badge is there just for people to know whether an article has it. Open source and open materials and pre-registration. So there's all these different badges. Open source, right, is really thinking about all of your source materials, all your syntax there, all your code. Open materials is you show every single thing the participants got in the study, which is really helpful for people trying to replicate your work. And I found this helpful when I'm trying to do studies, instead of having to email the author, like, can you send the exact instructions you did for that manipulation? It's already up. And you can, it just saves some time on the back end for making our science keep going. And then the pre-registration badge, of course. So this is an example of what badges would look like in it for a journal article. So they're just those little icons at the top there. So this one has the open data blue badge and the open materials orange badge. And again, they didn't have all the badges. You don't have to have them all. You choose what's appropriate and what's congruous with your process and project. Another great innovation that Ward mentioned earlier is posting preprints. I think making our work accessible for anyone and not hidden behind paywalls. That, especially if you think about trying to have an international psychology of religion and spirituality, we need this work to be out there so other people can see it. And so psych I never know how you're actually supposed to error X, or do you know
It's
how this is?
archive. I think it's just psych archive.
Archive. Oh, see, I've always just been confused. Sarc archive, but spelled funny in ways that confuse people. Right, you can post your preprint. So it's the version of the article at an early stage when you first submit it, I think is most typical. And then you could update it once the paper is revised. Just make sure you can't actually upload the proofed version from the journal. That typically violates the copyrights of most journals. Now, if it's an open access journal like Frontiers in Psychology or PLOS ONE, there it can be posted anywhere, which is something that's really cool too. But I strongly encourage people to start doing this, and it just allows us to keep everyone having access, and not just people who are at institutions rich enough to pay for library subscriptions. Well, Ward, I think I'll pass it back to you, and you can finish this out.
Okay. Thanks, Dr. Schnicker. So registered reports, we've already talked about them. We won't go in detail just for the sake of time. Essentially, this is a publishing format that is offered at some journals, and it is what we are going to be using in a grant that Dr. Schnicker mentioned a little bit ago, and we'll talk about in a minute. And in registered reports in this format, the research question and methodology is heavily emphasized. Theory is pretty heavily emphasized as well. And the peer review happens before you collect the data. You see here just an example of where that stage one of the peer review process happens. And there can and often is some refinement that happens at that stage one, just like there is in our typical peer review format. But if you do make it through the stage one process, then there is that in principle acceptance that is given, a provisional acceptance of the manuscript, regardless of what you find. Like Dr. Schnicker mentioned, if you have null results, if you did what you said you were going to do and what got approved, then those can still be published and are published. If you have accurately conducted the study and you are, according to the peer reviewers and editor, accurately interpreting the study and its implications. You see here that the stage two review happens after you have collected, analyzed your data, and written up the report. And then once you make it through, or if you make it through the stage two process, which most people, it sounds like, do, if they have that in principle acceptance and do what they said they were going to do, it just might, like we've mentioned before, take an iterative process of multiple rounds of peer review at that stage in order for it to get to a place of being accepted for publication. This is an example, and you see here it's a very big collaborative team that conducted this multi-site collaborative study and published their registered report. And you see Collabora Psychology is one of the example journals that is really leading the way in this open science framework. And here's an example of that register report format. Open science in your research will indeed help spread knowledge more broadly and more deeply, because it will be access to more aspects of what you have found, why you found it, why you set out to look for it in the first place. It will also greatly enhance application, because you will be able to be sharing your work, its materials, and the data more broadly, which will enable not only scholars to have access more broadly, but also clinicians, policymakers, teachers, and just the general public to have access to your data, materials, and findings that traditionally was only within the ivory tower. And it will just help greatly with disseminating findings and learning from what practitioners find based on your findings, because your data will be out there and they will be able to contact you as they are applying it and give you feedback or suggestions for follow-up. Lastly, open science in your research will help change social norms within the broader field of psychology within our subfield of psychology of religion and spirituality, and just within your general networks of collaborators, within your departments or within your practice, with your students that you're supervising, with your colleagues in science and practice. As more people become aware of open science practices and use them, it becomes the norm, and a lot of the myths gradually become explored, and the fears that people have, many of them very understandable, become allayed, just because you gain experience and you do see the benefits far outweigh the costs of this open science movement and its practices. There is a John Templeton Foundation grant that has been awarded, and it is one in which we essentially are trying to get our psychology of religion and spirituality field to use these practices more widely and to gain some experience in doing so, partly to alleviate many of these myths and fears that seem to exist. If you want more information about this potential grant-funded opportunity, please go to the website openscienceofreligion.com, and the call for papers is there, and you may contact any of us who are part of this grant for more information. At this point, we would love to just open it up for dialogue and questions. And